I thought betrayal would come with a bang. But in my case, it whispered, and I answered. That night, he looked at me and asked, "Where were you?" And I lied, because the truth would have destroyed us both. But what he didn't know was that I already knew about her. The perfume, the silence, the nights he disappeared. So I did something I never thought I would. And when he found out, it wasn't rage I saw in his eyes. It was recognition. Because we had both crossed a line, and there was no going back. Life has taken me to a place I never imagined I would reach. Perched on the brink of despair, grasping tightly to the final remnants of my dignity. Not long ago, all appeared to be in a state of equilibrium. I possessed a job, a residence, and a marriage that, though not without its flaws, offered a sense of stability. Yet now, all was drifting away like grains of sand slipping through my grasp. Invoices accumulated at a pace that outstripped my ability to monitor them. The digits in my bank account felt like a mocking jest, a stark reminder of my own vulnerability. Job applications lingered in silence, their echoes fading into the void. My inbox overflowed with rejection emails, each lead I pursued leading me to yet another dead end. I endeavored to conceal my frustration from Jake, my husband. Yet, the strain that hung between us had become utterly intolerable. He had transformed into someone entirely different from the man I had wed 5 years prior. I remembered the way he used to dance with me in the kitchen, his laughter echoing against the pots and pans. That man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. In those days, he would embrace me after a challenging day, reassuring me that all would be well. Yet in recent times, his gaze seldom found its way to me. His words were frigid and detached, as if I had merely transformed into yet another burden in the midst of his already overwhelming existence. Upon sharing the news of yet another unsuccessful job interview, his response was almost nonchalant. "I am striving with all my might," I had confessed, my voice trembling. He let out a weary sigh, his fingers pressing against his temples. "We cannot sustain ourselves on mere attempts, Claire. The bills are relentless." It wasn't the words he spoke. The way he articulated it was everything. As if he had already surrendered his hopes for me. Except, that night, I found myself wide awake, gazing at the ceiling, consumed by a sense of failure. The rent had fallen behind schedule. The landlord had previously issued us a caution. Only a handful of days remained before the specter of eviction loomed ominously over us. I contemplated reaching out to my parents, yet I found myself unable to do so. The weight of acknowledging my failure was unbearable. The following morning, after Jake departed for work without uttering a single farewell, I came to my conclusion. I found it necessary to engage in conversation with Mr. Donovan. Mr. Donovan commanded attention with his imposing stature, his tall, broad-shouldered frame exuding authority, and his attire always reflecting a meticulous sense of style. There was something unreadable in Mr. Donovan's eyes, something that suggested he had watched others fall before and done nothing. He bore himself with a subtle yet commanding presence. He possessed numerous properties in the vicinity, and his manner of managing affairs revealed an unmistakable aura of wealth and authority. Our interactions had been minimal, limited to the customary exchanges between tenant and landlord. I rapped gently on his office door, my hands quaking with anticipation. As he opened it, his dark eyes scrutinized me intently, as if he were already aware of the reason for my presence. "Claire," he said, his voice smooth as silk, as he leaned casually against the doorframe. "I had been curious about when you would arrive." His words coursed through me, sending a shiver down my spine. A faint smile tugged at the corners of my lips. "I simply require a bit more time to gather the rent. I lost my job, and the situation has been—" "I understand," he cut in. "I maintain a record of my tenants. Your journey has been fraught with challenges for some time now." Shame seared through my very being. I loathed the fact that he had taken notice. I took a deep breath and swallowed hard. If only I could secure an extension, I assure you I would. He let out a chuckle, shaking his head in disbelief. "Claire, landlords thrive on more than just assurances." The lump in my throat began to swell. I possessed no other gifts to give. I can't delay the payment further, he said. But there might be another way we could resolve this. His gaze held me captive, twisting my stomach in a knot of unease. I anticipated the direction of his words even before they left his lips. You're an impressive woman, Claire, he said calmly. I believe in mutual understanding when helping others. My body tensed up. I instinctively took a step back, thoughts swirling in a frenetic dance. The words lodged themselves in my throat. There's no pressure, he said, lifting his hands in a gesture of feigned innocence. Assistance is required. I can provide it. Without any expectations. Without any conditions or obligations. As though that improved the situation. I pivoted and strode away, my heart racing in my chest. I walked away from his office, but the echo of my silence stayed with me louder than any scream. As soon as I stepped outside, a sense of liberation washed over me, and I felt as though I could finally inhale deeply once more. Yet, the burden of his proposal lingered as I made my way back. Jake returned home in the late hours of the night. I lingered in anticipation, yearning for a glimmer of reassurance from him, a hint that he still held some affection. Yet, upon his entrance, he scarcely recognized my presence. You're late, I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. As the hours dragged on, he sighed, loosening his tie with a weary hand. I yearned to trust him, yet there was an unsettling quality in his voice that lingered.
Awry, Jake.
Are we all right? My voice hovered just above a whisper. He cast his gaze upon me then. For the first time in weeks, they truly gazed at me. Yet, in place of the warmth I longed for, all that met my gaze was sheer exhaustion. We're fine, Claire, he replied. Yet it resonated as a falsehood. I nodded, yet an emptiness lingered in my chest. That evening, my mind was consumed by thoughts of Mr. Donovan's proposition, contemplating the simplicity of uttering a single yes to navigate through this chaos. Yet the mere thought of it churned my stomach. I promised myself I would seek an alternative path. I was compelled to. I endeavored to cast aside the conversation with Mr. Donovan, yet it persisted, a shadow that infiltrated every thought. The hardest part was how tempting it felt when I was drowning in desperation. The rational side of me shouted that it was a mistake, yet another part, the one suffocating in monetary despair, murmured softly, "What options remain for you?" As the days unfolded, the situation continued to deteriorate. As I perused the seemingly infinite array of job listings, I dispatched my applications into the void, yet no responses materialized. I parted with old clothes, jewelry, and anything else I could let go of. Yet it scarcely sufficed for groceries, much less for rent. Jake hardly uttered a word to me these days. He returned home late, perpetually weary, perpetually aloof. There were nights when he vanished completely, leaving no trace behind. I began to observe the subtle details. His phone perpetually muted, much like the way he evaded my touch, the faint scent of a perfume that was not my own hanging in the air. I reassured myself that I was merely being paranoid, that the weight of stress was distorting my perception, conjuring visions that simply did not exist. Yet beneath the surface, I was aware. There was a fracture that had formed between us, an unspoken rift that lingered in the air. 3 days later, the eviction notice arrived. This is your last notice. Extensions are no longer an option. A knot formed in my stomach as I perused the paper, my hands trembling so violently that I struggled to keep a grip on it. I considered reaching out to Jake, yet I pondered the purpose behind it. He had shown no concern in the past, and he would remain indifferent now. That night, as I found myself solitary in our shadowy apartment, the weight of reality surged upon me like an overwhelming tide. Devoid of funds, employment, and assistance, I had pleaded, struggled, and exhausted every possible effort. Yet, nothing had proven effective. And then, as if taunting me from the shadows, Mr. Donovan's words reverberated in my mind. Mutual understanding. No obligations involved. I gazed at my phone, my fingers poised above his number. A heavy, nauseating burden took root in my chest as I grappled with my own thoughts. I had devoted my entire existence to the conviction that I would never waver in my principles. I would never allow myself to find my way into a situation such as this. Yet, I had never felt such desperation before. Initiate the call. He answered the phone almost immediately, his voice flowing effortlessly. Understanding.
Claire.
Your arrival was anticipated. Shame seared within me, yet I forced it down, burying it deep. Assistance is required. In that moment, I understood. The arrangement had been meticulously established. All it takes is a decision. You don't need to explain anything unless you wish. My hands trembled as I concluded the conversation. My heart raced with such intensity, I feared it might shatter my ribs. I lingered in silence for what felt like an eternity, grappling with the notion that I might actually follow through. I reassured myself that it was merely a singular occurrence, merely to navigate this passage, merely to endure. Yet beneath the surface, I was aware of the reality. There existed no concept of merely once. The weight of guilt settled long before anything ever happened. It seeped into my mind, constricting my thoughts like a tightening noose. I made a promise to myself to push Jake from my thoughts. I mustn't dwell on the impending action before me. For 5 years, my loyalty to him remained unwavering. Yet, was his loyalty ever truly mine? I yearned to trust that he had. Yet, the doubts resonated more profoundly than my attempts to dismiss them. Upon encountering Mr. Donovan once more, an unsettling sensation washed over me, as if I were treading a path from which there would be no return. His presence was overwhelming. He seemed so sure of the outcome, as if doubt was never an option. As soon as it concluded, a wave of nausea washed over me. Gazing into the mirror felt impossible. My body no longer felt like it belonged to me. It felt like I had given away a part of myself for something momentary, an issue that holds little significance in the grand scheme of things. Yet, a sense of relief washed over me. The rent had been taken care of. The eviction had ceased to loom as a threat. During the periods and months when I was not submerged, I convinced myself that it had come to an end. I would never repeat that experience. If only I could return to my life as though nothing had transpired. Yet, I found myself mistaken. As soon as I stepped back into my apartment, there he was, Jake, waiting for me. For my own sake. His gaze revealed an understanding that something had shifted. Jake's gaze held on to me with an intensity that felt unusual. Observing me with a scrutiny he hadn't employed in months. His gaze held an unmistakable difference. It's a different kind of fatigue, one that lacks the familiar signs of disinterest. Yet, there lingers a sense of doubt. Initially, he remained silent, observed me as I navigated the apartment, feigning a sense of normalcy. Yet I sensed it, the transition that exists between us. The burden of my actions loomed large, hung thickly in the atmosphere. Yet, despite the absence of evidence, an instinct within him stirred with certainty. I maintained my distance, fearful that proximity would betray the guilt etched across my features. Yet he remained silent that evening, more subdued than normal. At last, when he found his voice, it emerged with a serene steadiness. Calculated. Where did you find yourself today? A knot formed in my stomach. I found myself outside. He inclined his head with deliberation, his fingers drumming softly on the surface of the table. Where exactly? He paused, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. That sufficed for him. He refrained from pushing. Yet, the harm had already been inflicted. He didn't rage. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stepped back and watched something in me quietly dissolve. The ensuing days stretched on, laden with an unbearable weight. He exuded a chilliness. Further away, I believed I had concealed my guilt effectively. Yet, the tension that lingered between us thickened, constricting. He ceased his inquiries, yet I sensed them lingering in the atmosphere with each glance he cast my way. I made an effort to recall that he had been the one to create distance initially. I realized I wasn't alone in harboring secrets. The fragrance, The twilight hours. He had exited our marriage long before I ever came to my conclusion. Yet that understanding did little to quell the guilt that gnawed at my very core. In that moment, I stumbled upon the message. It was right out in the open. The phone lay abandoned on the counter. The screen glowed with a notification he had neglected to dismiss. An unfamiliar name. A message I longed to erase from my memory. Last night at Asterisk was truly remarkable. When will our paths cross once more? Asterisk. My chest constricted. The words swirled together, eluding my grasp as I struggled to make sense of them. Every fiber of my being cried out, insisting that this was a grave error. There must be an alternative explanation lurking beneath the surface. Yet I was aware of the truth. I had been aware for some time. I placed the phone down with great care, as if applying too much pressure would only exacerbate the reality. I stood in anticipation, bracing myself for the surge of anger to wash over me. Understood.
Claire, do not deceive me.
I severed the connection. Not at this moment. With a heavy sigh, he released the weight of his thoughts. He ran a hand over his face, as if the weight of the conversation had already drained him. It's not as you perceive it. I chuckled, yet the laughter held no trace of amusement. It truly never is it? The silence lingered, an expansive chasm between us. At last, he released a breath. I did not prepare for its occurrence. It simply occurred. The words pierced through the soul. Yet, what pained me more was the unsettling tranquility he exuded, as if he had already come to terms with it. It was as if he felt no remorse at all. What is the duration? My voice hovered just above a whisper. He paused, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. That sufficed as a response. A sensation of fracture resonated within me. The final strand that kept me intact is broken. And in that moment, the truth surged forth, impossible to contain any longer. I echoed the sentiment, saying, "Me too." He jerked his head upward. After months of waiting, I finally had his undivided attention. What is this? I compelled myself to lock gazes with him. Even as my heart raced, I followed suit. A flash of shock crossed his face, swiftly giving way to a more sinister expression. With whom? I took a deep breath. Someone who shouldn't have been involved. The ensuing silence was thick and oppressive. His expression contorted into an enigmatic mask, a blend of incredulity and fury. "Surely you jest," he uttered. Yet he was already aware that I wasn't. I gently shook my head. Desperation enveloped me. We stood on the brink of eviction. I found myself at a loss, unsure of the next step to take. His laughter cut through the air like a knife. Harsh. Thus, it renders the situation acceptable. I tightened my grip. My hands clenched into tight balls. Do you honestly believe what I did is worse than what you did? He moved nearer, his gaze searing into my own. At the very least, I made a choice to survive. I retorted. What is your reason? In that fleeting instant, silence enveloped us both. We simply remained in place, gazing into one another's eyes. We both came to the simultaneous understanding that there was nothing remaining to battle for. Whatever affection we once shared, the trust we once cultivated, it had vanished. Jake gave a slight shake of his head, taking a moment to reflect. This is beyond my capabilities. I sensed the inevitable before his words even left his lips. I am departing. I made no effort to intervene. I remained composed. I merely nodded, for within me, I had long understood that this was the inevitable conclusion. As he filled his bag and stepped out into the world, I remained on the couch, fixated on the void he had just vacated. He closed the door. But it wasn't the sound of wood meeting wood. It was the sound of everything inside me collapsing. I longed to hold on to the hope that my actions would leave everything untouched. If only I had the ability to mend it, that we might transcend it. Yet, the reality was that we had each been shattered long before this moment arrived. The stillness in the apartment was overwhelming. With Jake's departure, solitude enveloped me, a sensation I hadn't experienced in years. The time for waiting for his return has passed. The facade of normalcy has crumbled away. Only I remain, accompanied by the weight of my decisions. I devoted countless hours rationalizing my actions, persuading myself that it was a matter of survival. I found myself with no alternative. Yet, as I sat there, gazing at the void left by Jake's belongings, the truth loomed large, unavoidable, and stark. Long before I betrayed him, I had already betrayed myself. Survival transcended mere financial concerns. The essence of it lay in dignity, reflecting on the essence of my former self, in the depths of despair. And I had allowed that to fade away bit by bit, persuading myself that this was the sole path ahead. I reminisced about the moment when I first sensed everything beginning to unravel. As Jake began to distance himself, when the burden of our struggles grew overwhelming, I had placed the blame on him, harbored resentment towards him for no longer embodying the man he once was. Yet, had I truly remained the same woman he had wed? Or had I transformed as well, in ways I had yet to comprehend? The recent months had transformed me into a stranger to myself, a woman who had surrendered to despair, a woman who had lost faith in her own worth, a woman who acted from a place of desperation rather than from a position of strength. I found myself in search of the path that would lead me home. I immediately reached out to Mr. Donovan. The satisfaction in his voice was palpable as he responded, as if he had anticipated the reason for my call. Yet, I interrupted him before he had the chance to utter a word. "It is finished," I declared with conviction. Then a leisurely chuckle emerged.
"You've
received what you asked for, and now the choice is yours." I choked down the shame that seared in my throat. I erred. "I shall not attempt it once more." He let out a sigh, a hint of disappointment lingering in the air. "The decision is yours." I ended the call before he had the chance to utter another word. It transcended his singular existence. It was a journey towards reclaiming authority over my existence once more. On the journey of transcending the role of a victim to my own poor choices. In the weeks that followed, I devoted myself to the process of reconstruction. Not solely in terms of finances, but also in the realm of emotions. I accepted any work that came my way. Waiting tables, working freelance, doing whatever it takes to keep my head above water. The journey was far from simple. There were days when it seemed utterly unattainable. Yet, with each dollar I earned independently, with every modest stride I took, it felt as though a fragment of my essence was returning to me. Jake failed to make the call. He failed to send a message. I also did not make an effort to reach out. I had devoted so much time to clinging to something that was already shattered. Yet, at this moment, clarity dawned upon me. There are certain things that simply cannot be mended. At times, the wisest course of action is to release your grip. One evening, following a lengthy shift, I stood before the mirror, truly observing myself for the first time in months. I failed to notice the forlorn figure of a woman, burdened by a decision she could never undo. I encountered an individual of greater strength, a soul forged in the fires of adversity, resilient and unyielding. The past remained indelible, yet it was not destined to shape my identity. I discovered, through bitter experience, that desperation can drive individuals to actions they never imagined they would take. Betrayal often exists in shades of gray. At times, the most regrettable decisions arise from a wellspring of suffering rather than from a desire to harm. Yet I had come to understand that redemption exists within reach. Not by means of apologies, not by way of regrets. Yet, amidst transformation, I was not that woman. No longer. And I would never be that way again. I no longer wait for anyone to return. But sometimes, in the quiet, I still hear the echo of the woman I used to be, knocking. Have you ever made a choice you thought would save you only to lose yourself in it? Share your story in the comments. You never know who you might be helping. And if this journey moved something in you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us again for more stories that reveal what lies beneath the silence. What would you have done in Claire's place? Share your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your next favorite story might be just one video away.